So I'm Dr. Xander Evans. I'm the research director here at the Forest Guild, and we've just completed a report on fuel treatment practices for mixed conifer forests in the Southwest. That was a synthesis of existing research and interviews with managers, and so that's what all the comments I make today are based on having pawed through and read through all this material and talking with a lot of people about mixed conifer. The Joint Fire Science Program that initiated the guide we just completed on mixed conifer has also had a similar process for ponderosa pine, and that guide, led by Molly Hunter, focused on the Black Hills, Colorado Front Range, and the Southwest. And there are other guides for things like loblolly pine. And I should highlight that pretty soon there will be a guide for mixed conifer forests in the Northern Rockies, and that's led by Mike Battaglia, the Forest Service. And I think that will be out this summer. They're on a somewhat similar time frame as we are. And we've been trying to work with them to have our two guides be complementary. So for those of you not directly working in the Southwest, you may keep your eyes open for when that guide comes out. There's obviously a lot of overlap. There's some similarities, but there are also some key differences between those ecoregions. So this slide is a chance for me to recognize the co-authors, Rick Everett, who now works at the Salish Kootenai College in Montana, Scott Stevens, who teaches at University of California, Berkeley, and Jim Utes, who's the regional silviculturist here in the Southwest for the Forest Service. They obviously put a lot of work into this, and this couldn't have happened without them. So although I'm presenting today, obviously they had a lot to do with all this. And it's also important to recognize the 75 managers that we interviewed and talked with in trying to put this report together. They were very helpful in sharing details about their work and concerns, questions, things they discovered, and we tried as best we could to integrate those two, back them up with research in the report, or include them as sort of anecdotal findings. So today, one of the most important things we'll start out with is defining mixed conifer. It can be a very amorphous forest type, and so it's important to make sure we all are speaking the same language. Then we'll look briefly at the fire regimes and historic conditions for mixed conifer forests in the Southwest and talk about the impacts of the altered fire regimes. We'll look specifically at fuel treatment effectiveness and what kinds of treatments are most effective, and part of that is addressing slash, and towards the end we'll try to talk a little bit about integrating multiple objectives, which is probably the biggest challenge for managers. And in this talk today, I'm going to be sort of blazing along through sections of the report, but I would urge folks where you feel like I didn't quite cover it all or give it enough detail. The report does have a lot more detail, and so a lot of the things I'll touch on are covered in much more detail there. So starting out with defining mixed conifer, really what we're talking about is this band sort of in the middle elevations. This graphic is from Huckabee's work in Colorado, but it's with a slight change in elevations. It's probably relevant for many areas. And mixed conifers kind of ends up as this sort of ecotone or tension zone between what is often a ponderosa pine forest, here labeled montane forest, and a spruce fir forest higher up in elevation. And so it shifts in elevation based on aspect and other factors. The other part of a mixed conifer forest, obviously, the name implies, you see a wide variety of species. And this little list here in front of us includes species from both of the California areas as well as the Southwest and Central Rockies. Not all these species are going to be found in every stand, but it is important to recognize that there's a great degree of heterogeneity. We have everything from very shade intolerant species such as ponderosa pine or Douglas fir to very shade-tolerant species like white fir, blue spruce, Engelmann spruce. And then as Jim Utz and I were talking about the species mix and how they interacted, we sort of were thinking it's nice to remind everybody what we learned in Silvex, that many of these, the range of shade tolerance often reflects this range of, inverse of the range of fire tolerance, where when mature species like ponderosa pine or Douglas fir are very fire tolerant, whereas many of the species that are more shade tolerant, even when mature, are less fire tolerant. And that's why we don't have aspen on this graph, because it doesn't fit as well. It's both shade intolerant as well as fire intolerant, and so it doesn't fit very nicely, but it's obviously a key portion of mixed conifer. Many managers we talk to in the Southern Rockies, Southwest, like to sort of subdivide this general type of mixed conifer into a warm, dry, and a cool, moist type. And this doesn't work in everywhere, every place, every acre, but it can be a useful heuristic. It was also interesting to see that managers in California tended not to use this split as much. But here in the Southwest Southern Rockies, the warm, dry type is a little bit more open. We think of it as having a more frequent fire regime, dominated a little bit more by ponderosa pine, having some of these other species, but with ponderosa pine as more important. Whereas the cool, moist, less frequent fire and more Douglas fir, that's where we think of the aspen occurring. White fir and blue spruce, a larger component in a natural stand. And one of the things about these two types is it's a good way to start thinking about the heterogeneity across the landscape. And these two types or wider varieties of mixed conifer occur over very small areas. Just a change in aspect across a hillside will move you from a warm, dry mixed conifer where it's fairly open and maybe a lot of ponderosa pine to something that gets quite dense and has much more aspen or Douglas fir. And that's a key element to our mixed conifer forests. Now, in our southwestern mixed conifer forests, we obviously have some key drivers of fire. Lightning, as we all know, is fairly common. It's a high lightning area, so ignition sources are not limited. Added to the background lightning, we've had people around here burning for a long time. Native Americans probably burned mixed conifer forests less than they burned lower elevation forests where they spent more time, like ponderosa pine or pinon juniper, although there's some debate about that. But probably human burning had slightly less of an impact in mixed conifer than it did down elevation. But it still added to this background lightning ignitions. And also many of the fires that burn in ponderosa pine will burn upslope into mixed conifer, adding to the frequency in mixed conifer. Now, the last one I have on this list here is climate. And that's an important one to emphasize because it's one of those drivers of fire that is maybe a little bit harder to watch in a relatively short human lifespan or human career, because the longer periodic droughts that occur in all areas, but particularly in the Southwest, have important impacts on frequency of fire in mixed conifer. And so where we see multi-year droughts, those tend to be paired with fire years in mixed conifer forests. And the southern oscillation, the El Nino, La Nina switch, is also part of this drought cycle, and because of that, paired with fire occurrence in mixed conifer. And so keeping an eye on that and sort of understanding that that may be an overwhelming driver. Yes, fuels are important. Yes, lightning ignitions are important, but you may not get fire until the drought cycle is set up to where it's ready for a fire. Fuel loads, obviously you have to have something to burn, and we don't have great information on the historic fuel loads in mixed conifer forests. Some estimates like Dietrich's work said, well, it looked to him like it was in the range of 13 to 20 tons per acre. More recently, when they went out and surveyed what's out there today, they found about 13 tons per acre in southwestern mixed conifer stands. So there's a fair amount of fuel out there, and it, based on these two data points, which ain't much, but it's what we got, it doesn't seem like fuel loads probably are too out of whack in a sort of overall average sense. And one of the things we try to do in the guide is bring in other existing references and data. This is a series of photos from actually it's the Colorado photo series, Fuels photo series. And if you don't have this already and you work in this forest type, the link is in the mixed conifer guide itself, or I can send it out. And it's nice to have some visual about what 13 tons might look like, or that 20 tons might look like. And maybe we'll leave it there. When we were looking at fire regime, we wanted to figure out how frequent fires were in this forest type, and it seemed a good way to do that was to try to collect every example we could find where a researcher had gone out and actually measured the fire return interval. And so what we did is we found 48 sites in the southern Rockies and Southwest where somebody had measured the mean fire return interval. And it's a little bit dangerous to take this average and say, oh, well, it was 11 years, because some of these sites are different sizes, but it still gives you a nice picture, sort of an overall view, looking at these 48 sites, that on average 11 years was a common mean fire return interval. Another sort of nuance here is that researchers often use the more conservative measure of mean fire return interval, those fires which scarred at least 25% of the trees. And actually in this chart, the bottom measurements here, circle them here in yellow, include fires that scarred 10% of the trees. So again, it's a little bit apples and oranges, but it gives you some idea that where we're looking at fires that had a larger ecological impact, covered a larger area, the mean fire return interval is actually longer. It's closer to 20 years. And for me, one of the kind of contrasts I drew throughout working on this project was thinking about the ponderosa pine forest, these sort of monodominant ponderosa pines that have been well documented in the Southwest. And people have a nice vision of these frequent fires in ponderosa pine and the park-like stands, et cetera, et cetera. And for me, this was a contrast. Rather than, say, every 3 to 7 years where we might have fire in ponderosa pine, now we're talking about much longer, 11, 20 years of a fire return interval. And maybe even more importantly, we see when we look at the range of fires here, this sort of middle column, we see that there are some fires that had a 100-year or 125-year gap between fires. And that was within the historic range of variability. So, we might guess that these would be cool, moist stands that didn't burn as regularly because the fuels were still moist with ignitions. But they're part of the mixture out there of mixed conifer stands. And we, as managers, we need to identify, we need to accept that, hey, there are stands that didn't burn that frequently. And it doesn't kind of fit into that frequent fire model that many of us have kind of gotten used to from ponderosa pine. And along with that, the fire return, thinking about the fire severity, one of the things that comes up as we look at multiple studies of mixed conifer is that there are these patches of high severity, and they're a natural part of these mixed conifer forests. And some people on this call may feel like, oh yeah, I knew that, that's nothing new. But I think one of the reasons we're really sort of highlighting that, both in this report and as we talk to folks about it, is because, well, some fire professionals may say, sure, that's normal. That may be a bit of a surprise for the general public, or for upper management, or for other people within the fire community, within the forestry community, to think this is a forest type where tree death from fire was part of the natural process. And again, that's sort of a different pattern than people may be used to from ponderosa pine. So we've talked a little bit about what may have been going on pre-settlement, and it's probably no surprise to anybody on this call that we had huge land use changes. It's kind of the standard range of factors that are at play in mixed conifers, other forest types in the Southwest. Grazing, logging, all had an impact. And of course, I think probably the biggest impact is just the housing, more people, and that leads to fire suppression, not being real thrilled about having fires rip through these towns. So that's a pretty common story, but the key question for mixed conifer is, this was going on throughout the region, but what were the implications of these altered fire regimes, fire suppression, on mixed conifer stands? And when we look across numerous research studies of mixed conifer, what we see is that there's been an increased dominance of shade-tolerant species. So thinking back to that earlier chart, things like in the Southwest, white fir is the first one that comes to mind. But other shade-tolerant species, Colorado blue spruce, things like that, those have increased in dominance, both in number and in size, in mixed conifer stands. There's been an increase in density in many stands, so many researchers have gone to mixed conifer stands and based on tree cores and stand history can say this has become more dense than it was pre-settlement or in sort of a natural range of variability. Other studies have looked at forest gaps that have filled in over time, over this time of fire suppression. And one of the key things here is that there's been less of an impact in these sorts of variables on these cool, moist mixed conifer forests than there has been on the warm, dry. And that makes some sense when we examine it, because the warm, dry forests started out fairly open, while these cool, moist were probably more dense to begin with. So these cool, moist mixed conifer stands may not actually have changed all that much. And thinking back to the fire return intervals, they may not even have missed a fire, or they may that length of time without fire may well be within the historic range of variability. But when we look overall at the landscape, what we see is a drastic increase in homogeneity. Because if you imagine a relatively dense, cool, moist stand that hasn't changed, and a sort of warm, dry stand that has become much more dense, they become more similar. And as we look at a landscape of these stands mosaic together, we now have more continuity of canopy. We have higher densities across larger areas, and stands that may have started out as aspen are converting slowly to more shade-tolerant species. The aspen is senescing and dying. And so again, we have more homogeneity of species at the landscape level. So any individual stand may not have changed all that much. Even some of the warm, dry might not have changed all that much. But when we look at a landscape full of stands, then suddenly we realize, wait a minute here, we've moved into a situation that is categorically different than the historic range of variation. And the big concern, obviously, it's no news to anyone on this call, is high severity fires that burn over larger areas than did in the past. So while in the past we may have had patches of high severity fire, those patches were relatively limited in geographic area because they abutted an aspen stand that didn't burn very well, or they abutted a fairly open stand that where the fire would drop to the ground because there wasn't a canopy continuity. And it's also important to note that mixed conifer stands do not exist in isolation. Below them, the ponderosa pine stands have also become much more dense. And that story is a lot simpler. Essentially, all ponderosa pine stands have become more dense and are more able to support high severity fire. And so if we imagine those stands below, greater homogeneity in the mixed conifer stands above, we really have a whole landscape that's ready to move fire across them. And I think that's what we've seen in some of the large fires like Cerro Grande or Rodeo Chetaskai. Added on to this, well, of course, we've got climate change, and I won't paint a whole set of doom and gloom pictures, but I just chose one doom and gloom picture to share, and this is the decrease in precipitation. And the darker areas, areas like down here, that has a 40% reduction in precipitation by 2100. And all this hatched area is the area where they're relatively confident about the predictions. So much of what we're talking about, this mixed conifer in the Southwest and even California, is going to be a lot drier in the future. So we need to build that into how we think about managing, and this, of course, just adds to our worries about these large fires. So what do we do? How do we address these problems? And these, what I have, we need to think at the landscape scale. That's pretty clear. People talk about it all the time. And I think for some managers, they feel like, great, I need to work at the landscape level. How do I do that? Help me out. I only have a small area that's mine to work on, and how do I work at these larger areas? Or these boundaries are limiting me. And while there's certainly no silver bullet, I think it's worth pointing out that there are some efforts to work across boundaries and to help think about these landscapes rather than just a particular stand or a set of stands. So probably most people on the call know about the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program. There are a couple of good examples. One is that I'll mention again in this talk is in the Jemez here in New Mexico. And obviously the federal budget is very much up for debate these days, but if that program continues, that's going to provide some monies to work at a landscape scale and accelerate the pace of treatment and operations. There are also the Landscape Conservation Cooperatives. This is a Department of Interior initiative to bring together managers across an area that's ecologically appropriate rather than administratively appropriate. And I think one of their focuses is wildlife, and also they have an RFP out right now. It's a source of money, and so this may be something to turn to work collaboratively. And of course, this webinar is part of the Joint Fire Science Knowledge Exchange Consortia, and that hopefully will become more and more a way to identify partners across boundaries or find new information that may help work across boundaries. And the last thing that's sort of tied into this same topic is the Interagency Fuel Treatment Decision Support System. And for those of you who haven't heard about this, it's not a new modeling tool. Rather, Joint Fire Sciences is trying to give a easy, web-based front end to all the existing models. So rather than trying to come up with a competitor to FLAM map or consume, they said, well, what managers really need is a way to put data in an easy way and get intelligible results that work between multiple models, connecting FLAM map, the burn model, with the smoke models. And so that's sort of in a development stage right now, but even as I think since we wrote the guide, they've come out with a new version. So hopefully that will provide some new tools to identify how to do these landscape treatments. So while we need to think at a landscape scale, the treatments we do generally are done on a particular stand. That's sort of our unit of planning. And at the stand level, we have a couple of tools. The first one I want to talk about is prescribed fire. One of the things in reviewing the literature from both California and the Southwest that struck us was that in California, particularly in some parks like Yosemite and Kings Canyon, there is good documentation that their long prescribed fire program has been able to reestablish historic conditions in mixed conifer stands. So because they've been burning for 30 years, they've been able to use fire alone to restore these stands. Now, as we talked about it, we sort of realized that that's not really going to be applicable to a new prescribed fire program that's just starting, and rather than starting from relatively small trees that might be affected by fire, killed by fire, if you're starting in a stand where the trees are already mature, then fire isn't going to be able to make the transition that you want necessarily. So we'll return to this point again, but I guess it's maybe a two-part comment here that prescribed fire can be very effective depending on your starting conditions, but where you have these mature fire-resistant trees, you may need other tools as well. One of the questions that often comes up on prescribed fire is when. When do we burn? The burn windows are already so short. Do we need to burn in the historic season, or does it matter? And I thought one of the more insightful comments came from this paper from Eric Knapp that we have up on the screen now. And he basically says, look, it doesn't matter when you burn, just burn. And if it's not the right season, well, yeah, maybe that's not ideal, but it's so much more important to get fire on the ground than it is to worry about the season. And maybe once we begin to make some headway on all these stands that need attention, then we can start worrying about reinstituting fire at the appropriate season. So in combination with prescribed fire, the other main tool that we have at our disposal are silvicultural methods. We can do thinnings, we can do regeneration treatments. When we think about thinnings, again, we subdivide that into basically two categories: crown thinnings that really focus on the dominant trees, and low thinnings which focus on the suppressed subdominant trees and the ladder fuels. And obviously, reducing the canopy continuity and canopy bulk density, that's going to affect the spread of a crown fire and may actually mean that the crown fire can't spread through the canopy because there are too many gaps, it's too open. But on the other hand, the low thinnings are crucial to reduce the ladder fuels and change fuel behavior in the understory. And because low thinning can take out some of the suppressed trees, you can affect canopy bulk density and to some extent canopy continuity with a low thinning, although not as much as with a crown thinning. Now, one of the things that managers mentioned when we went out and chatted with people was that they were using gaps and putting in openings from 1/4 acre to 3 acres within these mixed conifer forests for a couple of reasons. One was to change the fire behavior and to reduce the wildfire hazard, because obviously if you have a nice big opening, that's going to change how fire spreads through that area. But it also helps regenerate species that we might prefer to see in a mixed conifer stand, like ponderosa pine or Douglas fir or aspen, that are all shade intolerant. They're going to need a nice open space, unlike the white fir that's already regenerating just fine in the shade. The other thing that I'll sort of highlight here with these group selection cuts or patch selection cuts, there is a natural analog here that some of that high severity fire, those patches of high severity fire that we see in the historic fire regime, can be mimicked by putting in these gaps and that may be sort of preferable for some areas than allowing a fire to burn through and reach that high severity level. That might be a little nerve-wracking, but if we put in these gaps, we can establish that greater heterogeneity that we've lost in some of these stands. Now, no matter what we're doing when we're cutting these trees, we need to be concerned about the slash, both the crown thinnings or the low thinnings. We need to go in and address the slash, and there are some sort of scary stories about fires moving through stands where the slash hasn't been treated and the resulting impacts, high mortality, that sort of thing, just because the fuel loads get to be quite high and can generate a lot of heat and hence high severity, a lot of mortality. So there are a couple options for treating slash as well: pile burning, broadcast burning. Those fairly common. Thousands of piles burned across the Southwest and Southern Rockies every year. Slash removal, we're not going to dwell on this, but this is really market driven. Where you have the opportunity to do a whole tree harvest or pull slash out and sell it for biomass, for chips or something, a lot of managers are taking advantage of that. And it was interesting to talk to managers in very similar areas, one of whom had access to a mill or some kind of market, another of whom didn't. And without that market, your options become much more limited. And so having markets really opens up a slew of possibilities for kinds of fuels treatments that are just not possible if you don't have that market. And so then you turn back to things like pile burning or broadcast burning. Now the other one, my list, mastication, we'll actually talk a little bit more in depth, and I wanted to focus on mastication in this talk because I feel like it's a less well-known approach to treating fuels, although it is becoming more common. So obviously when I say mastication, I'm talking about chipping or grinding, any of those processes that takes a tree or slash and converts it to these small pieces. I sort of like the word mastication, so that's what I've settled on. Other people always call it chipping or something else. But when we do this mastication work, we're not actually removing any of the fuel. We're just changing its form. And so we're changing it from maybe a ladder fuel, a small tree, or coarse woody material, 1,000-hour fuels. We're changing it to 1, 10, and 100-hour fuels, these small pieces. And so when fire eventually does come through, either prescribed or wildfire, it's going to change how that fire burns. So it may not burn, if they were removing ladder fire fuels, it may not get up into the canopy because we've taken those ladder fuels and changed them to surface fuels, but they're still likely to burn and in some cases can burn quite hot. It can allow fires to spread more easily because you have the sort of continuity of these surface fuels. And it can also burn very hot at the soil surface, and that heat can cause some residual damage, either by killing some of the biological life in the soils or even tree roots, causing tree mortality. And some initial research has sort of highlighted if you have a particularly dry soil or if your chip depth is getting very deep at more than 3 inches, that's when you need to start worrying about some deleterious soil effects when the fire does come through. That said, managers, particularly one I always think of in the San Juan National Forest in Colorado, were really pleased with the way the masticated fuels burned. It was, unlike other burns in their mixed conifer forest, they felt like it was a little easier to handle. They were a little more consistent in terms of flame length and that sort of thing. And so it was a bit more manageable. And I think we'll delve into this a little bit more, but where fires in mixed conifer are a little bit trickier to implement than in ponderosa pine or some of these other forest types. And so anything managers can do to make things easier, something like mastication to make the fuels more consistent, may be a good first step. Maybe you're not going to have a 50-year program of always masticating before a prescribed fire, but in trying to initially bring fire back as a process, it may be a key step. Okay, effectiveness. One of the things that struck me as we looked into effectiveness of treatments in mixed conifer forests was that I feel as though the landscape, the knowledge landscape has changed significantly in the last decade or so. 10 years ago, when if we had had the same conversation, there would have been a lot more questions. Now, we can very confidently say that when you combine a thinning that treats both of the canopy and the understory, sort of a low and a crown thinning, and you combine that with a prescribed fire, you're going to be very effective at changing wildfire behavior. And I don't think there's a lot of doubt left on this. Unfortunately, one of the ways that we can convince ourselves of this fact is by looking at areas where wildfire has burned through a treatment. And this image below is from the Angora fire in South Lake Tahoe. And the area that's bounded in yellow here, there are a lot of brown crowns, but they're not the black dead crowns that we see out here in this high severity area. Rather, the fire dropped to the ground, and so there was a fair amount of scorch. But my understanding is many of these trees actually survived. And more importantly, the fire dropped to the ground, and so the firefighters were actually able to do some attack on the fire and save some of the houses in the neighborhoods in front of the fire. Obviously, some didn't survive, but it would have been a lot worse had that treatment not been put in place. And there are other examples from across the area we looked at where fuel treatment in mixed conifer has been put to the test and shown to be effective. And in the guide itself, I kind of delve into, well, how effective is just mechanical, how effective is just prescribed fire, and that sort of thing. So I point you back to the guide for those sorts of details. Obviously, we have to somehow maintain these treatments. Effectiveness of a treatment declines after about 10 years. This is based on a couple of studies. And I want to highlight, sort of bring that back around when we talked about the fire regime. It's sort of nice that this 10-year number is somewhat similar to the 11-year mean fire return interval that we talked about. It's kind of gratifying to think that, hey, there's a ecological reason why we need to think about retreating these areas after 10 years, because that's something like the average fire return interval. Obviously, we can go back in and do mechanical every 10 years, but it would be nice, certainly from a cost and an ecological process perspective, to find ways to bring fire back in as part of that retreatment effort. Okay, I want to change gears a little bit here and think about other objectives. So there's obviously reducing fuels and addressing wildfire hazard is a big concern for many people, but it's not in isolation. We also have to worry about wildfire. And I think as I was looking at this information and trying to sort it out, one of the things that sort of jumped out at me that may be common sense is that large areas of high severity fire are not very good for wildlife either, not in a forest type where it's not part of the historic regime. So I guess I sort of like to start from that, hey, there's an area of agreement here. Neither the Hayes mountain salamander nor the Mexican spotted owl is really excited to have large swaths of their habitat with complete mortality. So then we move on to, okay, if we can kind of agree on that as a reduction of these uncharacteristic fires as a goal, then how do we do it in a way that permits wildlife populations, particularly these threatened and endangered species, to thrive? And I think there's been there's beginning to be a bit of a change in how we approach this, and where in the past managers might have said, well, it's a Mexican spotted owl habitat or nesting and roosting area, I'm just going to leave it alone. Now I think there's more and more a realization that those areas have to be included in the landscape plan as well. And maybe their place in that landscape plan is that they're not going to be treated, they're going to be less dense. But if it fits in a mosaic of heterogeneous conditions, that may be fine. If the surrounding stands are in a condition where they're not going to support a crown fire, then there's less risk that a crown fire is going to come rushing through an owl pack. And I think there's some good modeling out there right now that I tried to highlight in the guide that says, look, we can go in and thin and burn owl nesting and roosting areas without negatively impacting their offspring or their ability to reproduce and their fitness. And there are some forests that are beginning, some Forest Service areas that are beginning to implement these treatments. The Cibola is one that comes to mind. But others are beginning to experiment, and we need to make sure we share those successes, and hopefully not, but maybe even the failures, so that others can learn from those and begin to feel confident that a fire in those areas can work. And one example where we may, in a couple of years, be able to share some nice success stories is this Jimenez Mountain salamander that's in, obviously, New Mexico. And that's one of the focal points of the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program up there. And one of the goals is to design treatments that protect the salamander, both from the immediate effects of treatment, but also from large wildfires. So that'll be one. I think there's some information specific in the guide, but it's also one to watch in the future and to talk about with our colleagues and maybe be the subject of future field trips or workshops within the Southwest Fire Science Consortium. Of course, there's not just wildlife that we have to worry about. We also have to worry about forest health, and this has gotten a lot tougher. New diseases, new pests have come into the Southwest, and so we have to worry about these now too. Aspen, not only is aspen declining because it's getting old in general, since fire suppression, less aspen's been regenerating, but there's also the sudden aspen decline, SAD disease. And it was somewhat encouraging. I talked to some managers in southwestern Colorado who said that some of the overstory removal treatments they've done in SAD stands, sort of these patch cuts, were having some success in regenerating aspen, even though it had been affected by SAD. And so that was a good sign that it's not a one-way street there. And other of those gap treatments that we discussed before, or even just returning fire in a prescribed fire sense, will help aspen recover throughout the mixed conifer range. White pine blister rust is spreading. If you don't have white pine blister rust where you work right now in the Southwest, you will have it. You might as well just assume it's coming. And I think the real take-home message, at least for me, I think I've lost my connection here. Hopefully everybody else is still looking at the forest health image. Sorry about that. But the take-home message on white pine blister rust is that we really want to protect individual white pines, 5-needle pines in general, because they may have some genetic resistance to the blister rust. And maintaining that resistance in any individuals out there is going to be crucial for survival of the species. Not every tree is going to have resistance, but you don't know when you're out marking which tree is resistant. And so the general idea is leave as many as you can, and we'll begin to see as those that aren't resistant die, we'll be glad we saved the ones that were. Okay, it looks like much of the the webinar is down, so I'm going to sort of freestyle it on the remaining portion. And we're sort of wrapping up. We'll move into the questions and answers in just a minute here. But there were some overarching ideas that I wanted to kind of hammer home, and some are institutional. There's this idea that we have to collaborate. It's no longer a sort of addition to what we do on a normal daily basis, but it's just part of the regular work. And it's no longer in terms of budgets and funding. Collaboration is no longer a new source of funding. Rather, it's becoming a sort of support for basic programs. And so I think sort of accepting that and saying, okay, well, this is the way the world works now is a wise choice at this point. Programs like the CFLRP are going to become more common, and that's going to be where forestry and fuels monies come from, I think. Okay, great. Can you go to the next slide? Another sort of institutional issue is the transfer of knowledge. There are a lot of fire science professionals, foresters who are retiring, and or even leaving a district. And when those people leave, we lose a lot of knowledge. And so both very specific knowledge about a particular area, but also good knowledge about getting fire out and on the ground. And we need to make sure that we're doing our best to learn from those who have a lot of experience on the ground. And so mentoring programs, those sorts of things are pretty crucial. And that leads into this idea of building confidence. And learning from experts is one way to build confidence. Another is implementing treatments on a landscape scale so that if there's a nice shaded fuel break in the WUI and the ponderosa pine's been thinned to sort of historic levels, then managers feel more confidence in going in and returning a fire that may have patches of high severity in a mixed conifer stand. And I think that's a pretty key point, is trying to find ways within a particular organization, whether it's thinning or bringing upper management out into the woods to look at a particular site and ensuring that they have the confidence and their support for bringing fire and these fuels treatments into mixed conifer stands. And of course, this ties in with the issues of the patches of high severity fire that I sort of emphasized earlier, this heterogeneity at the landscape scale being a crucial element. And then the last point I have, I've sort of gone out of order, but the last point I have is that we know that these combined crown and low thinnings with prescribed fire are effective. So those are 6 points out of this fairly long report, and I think there probably other folks will find other elements that hit home for them, but I wanted to highlight these. And so let's go to the last slide here. So this is where I wrap it up, and what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take it off mute. So if you've got the radio blaring in the black background, if you can turn that off, and we'll open it up for questions. We'll try to end in about 7 minutes or so, but if you have questions, feel free. You should, I've unmuted the line, so you should be able to shout them out. And I know, at least here in this office, we lost our connection to the webinar, so if you put in a chat question, it may have gotten lost, and you might have to just shout out now. So are there any, do we still have folks out there? Are there any reactions, thoughts, questions?
Hi, my name is Susan Jane Brown, and I do some collaborative restoration work in eastern Oregon and the interior Columbia Basin, and I'm interested in how applicable this report is to restoring the mixed conifer forests out in that region. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. We tried to be as true as we could to the regions sort of listed on the cover and really hold ourselves to scientific articles where the field work was done in those areas. So things like the fire return interval, just ignore that. You're going to have to wait for Mike Battaglia's guy to come out this summer because that's not relevant to you. But I think some of the maybe more overarching ideas are quite relevant, particularly some of the institutional barriers, things like this idea of mentoring as a way to kind of grab some knowledge from people who may be retiring, thinking at the landscape scale, this heterogeneity. Those are all, I think, a little bit more universal across mixed conifer types. And my guess is, although, as I say, I've really tried to keep to California and Southwest papers, my guess is some of these issues about patch size might even be larger up where you are. The frequency of high severity and size of high severity patches is probably larger. So some things will just be increased for you. But again, I'll defer and we'll see what the Northern Rockies mixed conifer field treatment guy has to say.
And do you have an estimated time of arrival for that, or can we expect to hear from you again when that is available?
I will certainly email everybody on this list because I think it'll be of some interest. And I've been in touch with Mike, and I thought his deadline was June, but often we always find ways to get around deadlines. So I think this summer would probably be a good guess.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Other questions or comments?
Lorna Doberfall, the Department of Fish and Game, California. Can you
Welcome.
Hello?
Yes.
I was just wondering what kind of silvicultural treatments you might recommend for plantations on private landscapes to increase heterogeneity.
Well, one thing that we actually talked with folks from Collins Pine and from WM Beatty, both private landowners, and I think we also did an interview with someone from Sierra Pacific Industries. And at least in some of those private land holdings, Collins in particular comes to mind, they really emphasize uneven age management through group selection. And so I guess there's obviously on a private land where you have an existing plantation, there's the financial concern is a big driver. But I think that examples like Collins, and I think there are people at Collins who might even be willing to talk to another private landowner and say, yes, this opening up, say, 5-acre gaps for regeneration of sugar pine or other pines that will be of high value does work and can make financial sense. So I guess that would be my pitch, is to think about moving from an even age system that might involve planting to an uneven age system of, even if they're fairly large patches or large gaps, at least then you're moving towards that more, a process that's more analogous to the historic fire regime. Does that help at all? Is that along the lines you were thinking?
A little bit. I've been following Malcolm North's work and talking about groups and gaps and identifying not just single tree but groups of trees as areas to protect, and then elsewhere have a higher, more trees taken out elsewhere so that you're getting this kind of groupy, gappy kind of heterogeneity across the landscape. But in an existing plantation, a mature plantation, how do you put that together? And I know that they are grappling with that at Sagehen Experimental Forest up in Truckee right now.
Yeah, and I don't think that there's no blueprint for them. But I think this idea of, if you can financially, if you can find a way to delay harvest of some of those mature trees and say, yes, maybe we could make some money on them now, but we're going to leave them, regenerate a gap, and then come back for them. They're going to add some volume anyway, so there may be you maybe get into a higher value product category. And so I think there's sort of a translation, because obviously you're right that Malcolm North's work is really, we cite that a couple of times. That's great foundation and really supports this idea of heterogeneity. And so just finding some way of building that in, and I think some sort of gap is probably a good place to start.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. We had one question come in on the chat box on the homeowners defensible space in mixed conifer. Is there too small an area to be effective? And that I should probably not even take a guess at. I mean, I think that anything is better than nothing. And certainly from the perspective of even if you're just clearing your lot in a kind of fire-wise approach, moving firewood stacks away from the house, it makes that house more defensible when the fire crews arrive. So even those what might seem like little steps can make a big difference. In terms of clearing that back 40, I think the distance that it makes a difference is determined by what kind of fire you get coming through. And so even if you can only clear 100 feet or something, if that might make a difference if it's not a blasting wind. And I think maybe I'll because I'm not able to answer that question particularly well, I'll choose a related question and answer that. And I think that sort of shaded fuel break style treatments in the WUI areas in mixed conifer forests, although they don't have any particular natural analog, there's no natural stand where trees are spaced at 16 feet with no understory. That may be very important for managers on mixed conifer beyond that break to have a much more natural setting because if there's a nice wide shaded fuel break before the WUI, managers of sort of the wilderness or the back 40 or whatever is beyond that may be more willing to experiment with prescribed fire that might include patches of high severity or treatments that aren't as severe and guaranteed to have no fire. So I can't answer the specific question of how large a distance is worthwhile for WUI treatments, but I can say that they can fit into this kind of landscape view of how to deal with mixed conifer. Other questions on the people want to type in on the chat or shout out on the phone? We're now at an hour, so if you want to drop off, feel free. Thank you for participating, and I will follow up a little later. Probably tomorrow. We'll send out a recording of this webinar in case you want to share it with a colleague or review some information, and I'll also follow up as soon as I get the information on when the mixed conifer for the Northern Rockies will be available. So with that, we can kind of go with some more questions, and people who want to drop off can drop off, and I'll thank you all for participating.
I have a question.
Yeah.
This is Patrick Shannon from Sustainable Northwest, and I work with the collaborative group on the Malheur National Forest in Eastern Oregon. And I have a question regarding sort of your treatment prescription of a quarter acre to 3 acres for a gap. In the rest of the area, do you have leaf patches, and do you have a size that you look for in leaving those?
Oh, in terms of leaving some sort of reserve of, say, dense forest or where you're not cutting anything?
Yeah, to kind of go through the heterogeneity and mosaic idea.
Yeah, and to be honest, that didn't come up as much. Now, as you mentioned it does seem sort of like the obvious reverse of how big the gap should be. But it didn't come up as much, and I think maybe part of that is driven in a lot of mixed conifer areas. I know in the southwest in California, the spotted owl sort of dictates these similar sort of dense patches where you can cut little or nothing because of where they're already roosting or where they could potentially roost. And so those are already sort of out on the landscape. And so I think there's less of an emphasis on adding additional ones. But one way to think about it would be in the sort of classic silvicultural sense, if you're thinking about regenerating an entire 1,000 acres and you put in a whole bunch of 3-acre gaps, and then in 30 years you go in and you put another bunch of 3-acre gaps in the areas you didn't do before, eventually you would hit all the whole 1,000 acres. And so some of those reserves, you might use the same sort of size if you were actually sort of thinking along these silvicultural lines, because then when you went to regenerate those, they would be of a large enough size so that you could still regenerate shade-intolerant species in the middle. Now, in your context, you may be thinking about areas that are never going to get cut. You want as reserves for other reasons. And I think that probably the other drivers, whether, I know for a lot of Native American tribes there are some cultural issues or sensitive sites, those are never going to get cut. And it's not an ecological size determinant, but rather sort of these other factors that would drive them to choose a size. And so I think the only limiter on that would be thinking about how big a patch you would be willing to have burn. And I would point in the guide, there's an interesting example from the Moonlight Fire that cut up in your direction in Northern California, where there were a bunch of untreated areas. They had a fire come through, and boy, those got really cooked. And so if you sort of imagine, or even if you have the ability to hire a fire modeler to model a relatively severe fire conditions and what a fire would do, you can then say, well, we'll leave those uncut because that's the largest area we're willing to lose in one sort of high severity patch. I don't know. Does that help at all in your thinking?
Yeah, no, that's what I was looking for. Yeah, it's helpful. Thanks.
Great. And we've got 2 other questions that came in on the chat. One about biochar and the potential to use biochar as a way of getting rid of some of the slash. And certainly, I haven't personally seen that work yet. I feel like it's one of those things, like maybe it's beginning to happen and I just haven't seen it, or it's on the cusp. But I would say that anyone who's willing to take the slash, I'm all for having them help out because there's some carbon emissions and other reasons why it makes sense not to be burning piles in the woods if you don't have to. And so to the extent that the biochar is a viable option, I think it's worth supporting. I just haven't seen it work yet. So there was another question on chips and mastication and the size of the chips and the burn rates. And I'm going to have to sort of plead in specificity here and say that it's probably worth, for those specific questions, turning back to the report itself, and we might have to delve into the original study. And actually, Mike Tagliafico, working on the Northern guide, also did some of that research, and so that might help. But I think some of this data on masticated fuels and the appropriate fire model to use masticated fuels isn't available yet. And so there's a little bit of uncertainty out there. Yeah, and I think I will stand by the idea that the spread can be quite rapid, and you can have pretty high heat rates. But I think it does depend on the particular burn day conditions and the fuel moisture and those sorts of things. So I'm not answering your question very well. We can follow up on email, or and I can sort of share with you some of these other reports, because I think that's the level of detail you'll need. Mm-hmm. And I see that Jim has answered in that the mastication question needs to be discussed in terms of soil heating and tree root mortality. And yeah, that makes, I mean, really what we're most concerned about here is how hot it gets in the soil, and that has a lot to do with the residence time. But again, I think that where you need that level of detail, we can dive into the report and supporting materials. Other questions or comments? Okay, well, I think we'll sort of close it off here. I really appreciate everybody joining, and we'll follow up with some emails, and I hope you all find the guide useful. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Yep.
Thanks. Thanks a lot.